On the night of March 20th, 2009, Emirates Flight 407 came dangerously close to disaster as it tried to take off from Melbourne Airport. With 275 people on board, a simple pilot mistake almost turned a routine flight into a fiery crash. The aircraft was seconds from disaster, still scraping the ground as it raced down the runway. How did a small error almost cost so many lives? And what lessons were learned from this terrifying near miss? Let's find out. It was a calm, clear night, perfect for flying. The aircraft, a 5-year-old Airbus A340-500, had an excellent safety record. The crew was experienced, with a captain holding over 8,000 hours of flight time and a first officer responsible for inputting the plane's weight into the system. Because of the flight's length, the airline assigned 4 pilots instead of 2 for added safety, but more is needed to prevent the mistake. As the plane sped down the runway for takeoff, everything seemed fine, until it wasn't. The aircraft struggled to lift off, and the tail struck the ground, causing sparks to fly. Passengers had no idea what was happening inside the cabin, but they felt the jolt and saw the glow of sparks as the plane barely lifted into the air. It was a terrifying moment. Then at 10:18 p.m., Emirates Flight 407 backed away from the gate, ready for its journey to Dubai. Everything seemed routine as it moved toward the runway, but things took a turn when the plane began its takeoff at 10:30 p.m. The massive A340 accelerated down the runway, but something felt off. The aircraft wasn't moving as quickly as it should. As the plane neared the speed needed to lift off, the captain ordered to pull up the nose, but nothing happened. The first officer tried harder, but the aircraft stubbornly remained on the ground. The situation grew critical as the end of the runway approached. With the plane still on the ground, the captain had no choice but to push the engines to full power in a last-ditch effort to get airborne. Finally, the plane's nose lifted, but not without a violent tail strike that sent sparks flying across the runway. The impact was hard enough that passengers could hear the loud grinding of metal and see the terrifying red glow from the sparks illuminating the night. The aircraft barely cleared the end of the runway, scraping against an antenna and runway lights before it finally lifted into the sky. The pilots were in shock in the cockpit. They couldn't believe what had just happened, but there was no time to reflect. A warning light indicated that the tail strike had caused significant damage to the plane. The pilots needed to act quickly, as the damage affected the aircraft systems and even created holes in the fuselage. The crew contacted air traffic control, who confirmed that debris from the plane had been found on the runway. The need of that time was that they had to return to Melbourne, but there was a major problem. The plane was too heavy to land safely. With 130 tons of fuel on board, they had to dump about 80 tons to reduce the landing weight. The plane circled over Port Phillip Bay, releasing fuel, while the crew tried to understand how they ended up in this mess. The first officer soon discovered the root cause. The electronic flight bag, EFB, had miscalculated the plane's weight by nearly 100 tons. The plane had been much heavier than the system believed, leading to the slow takeoff and the dangerous tail strike. Not only this, the tail strike had also damaged the plane's pressurization system as if things couldn't get worse. The aircraft was losing cabin pressure, creating an even more urgent situation. The pilots declared an emergency, and Flight 407 was given priority to land. The weight issue was critical, but they could only dump a little fuel if they needed to make more than one landing attempt. After some quick calculations, the crew decided to reduce the plane's weight to 280 tons, still above the safe landing weight, but with enough fuel for a second attempt if necessary. Since the pilots were prepared for the emergency landing, a flight attendant called the cockpit with disturbing news. Smoke had been spotted at the back of the plane. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The crew now faced the possibility of a fire on board, adding another layer of danger to the already critical situation. Time was running out, and they had to land fast. The captain ordered the crew to prepare for an emergency evacuation upon landing. Then the decision was made to land on runway 34, even though it meant landing with a tailwind, which would make the landing riskier. The captain had to be precise. Any mistake could result in a crash. As the plane descended, tension filled the air. The overweight aircraft, with a damaged tail and the threat of fire looming, was rapidly approaching the runway. The captain applied maximum braking and reverse thrust to stop the plane before it ran out of the runway. After what felt like an eternity, the plane stopped right at the edge of the runway. Meanwhile, emergency teams were waiting to extinguish the fire and assist the passengers. Luckily, there was no fire, and everyone on board was safe, though the aircraft had suffered significant damage. It was a near miss, and the pilots couldn't believe they had managed to land the plane without further disaster. Just as the ground crews inspected the runway, they found pieces of the aircraft's tail scattered along the tarmac. The tail strike had been worse than anyone realized, and the fuselage damage had been severe. The holes in the aircraft's skin explained the loss of cabin pressure. The pilots managed to control the situation, but it was clear that several errors had led to this near tragedy. After the incident, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, ATSB, found two main issues. During pre-flight checks, the first officer made a critical error when entering the takeoff weight into the electronic flight bag, EFB, a tool used to calculate takeoff settings. Instead of inputting the correct weight of 362 tons, he accidentally entered 262 tons, making the plane appear much lighter. This mistake went unnoticed by the entire crew. They didn't catch it during their final review, and a required verbal check of the data was skipped, meaning the flight was ready to take off with the wrong settings. The ATSB also pointed out that the crew didn't follow the correct procedures when checking things before the flight. Although human error was the main cause, the captain's quick thinking, especially after the plane went off the runway, likely prevented a much worse outcome. Along with this, there were false claims that the pilots used less fuel to save money or were too tired from long hours. The investigation will now focus on understanding why the wrong numbers were entered into the flight planning system. On top of that, adding to the problem was that many of the crew were used to flying the smaller A330 aircraft, where the performance figures they saw were common. As a result, the weight miscalculation went unnoticed until it was too late. This series of errors created the perfect storm that almost led to disaster. No doubt, Flight 407 had narrowly avoided disaster, and the passengers and crew were safe. The pilot's quick thinking and calm under pressure had averted one of the worst air disasters in history, but the damage to the aircraft was extensive. The flight crew would later reflect on the series of mistakes that had led to this terrifying ordeal, realizing how close they had come to tragedy. Fortunately, at 11:25 p.m., Emirates Flight 407 stopped, ending a horrible night for everyone on board. The passengers disembarked, shaken but unharmed, grateful to be alive after a near miss that could have ended in catastrophe. In response to the post-event investigations, Emirates changed its pre-flight procedures, adding a system where two people must enter data to avoid mistakes. Airbus also updated its software to catch incorrect data. Aviation safety organizations around the world also introduced new guidelines to improve safety. Overall, these changes, alongside improvements in aircraft technology, have made incidents like Flight 407 far less likely. This incident of Flight 407 showed just how critical accurate data and careful pre-flight checks are for safety. Thankfully, no one was injured, and all 257 passengers and 18 crew members survived. However, the pilots and crew were fired when they returned to Dubai, and were told not to contact anyone as their phones were monitored. What do you think was the most crucial factor that helped the pilots of Emirates Flight 407 prevent a disaster? Please share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe to the channel.